The devastating and ultimately redemptive story I'm about to share with you began on a Black Tuesday morning in March that would forever be seared into the memory of Henrique Tavares, as the day his entire carefully constructed world collapsed in the span of approximately 6 hours, transforming him from a wealthy, arrogant real estate developer worth an estimated $300 million into essentially a bankrupt failure facing criminal charges and public humiliation on a scale he could never have imagined possible when he woke up that morning in his palatial mansion, believing he was untouchable and that his success was permanent and deserved. Henrique was 53 years old, tall and imposing with silver hair and an expensive wardrobe, and the kind of supreme confidence that comes from decades of winning and accumulating and never experiencing real consequences for cutting ethical corners or treating people as disposable resources rather than human beings with dignity and rights. He had built his fortune through a combination of genuine business acumen, strategic risk-taking, aggressive negotiations where he always insisted on terms heavily favorable to himself, and what he privately acknowledged were occasional legally questionable practices involving bribery of government officials to secure favorable zoning decisions and construction permits, fraudulent financial reporting to banks and investors about the true costs and profitability of projects, and systematic exploitation of construction workers through wage theft and unsafe working conditions that maximized his profits while treating worker safety and well-being as irrelevant externalities. Henrique had always believed he was smarter than everyone else and that rules and regulations were for ordinary people who lacked his vision and courage, and he surrounded himself with enablers and yes-men who reinforced his narcissistic worldview and never challenged his increasingly risky and unethical decisions. The catastrophic collapse began at 7:45 that Tuesday morning when Henrique received simultaneous calls from his chief financial officer and his attorney, both screaming urgent warnings that federal investigators had just executed search warrants at all the company's offices and construction sites, seizing computers and documents and interviewing employees, apparently as part of a massive fraud investigation that had been building secretly for over a year. Within an hour, news of the investigation was all over the business media, with reporters camped outside Henrique's mansion and offices demanding statements, and his investors and lenders began calling frantically demanding meetings and explanations and threatening legal action to protect their interests. By 10 o'clock that morning, 3 major banks had frozen his credit lines and demanded immediate repayment of outstanding loans totaling over $100 million. Effectively cutting off all the cash flow that kept his highly leveraged business empire functioning. By noon, the stock price of Henrique's publicly traded holding company had crashed by over 80% as investors panicked and sold, wiping out hundreds of millions in paper wealth and triggering margin calls on stock he had pledged as collateral for personal loans. By 2 in the afternoon, his board of directors had held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove him as CEO and chairman, appointing an interim management team to try to salvage whatever value remained in the company and to cooperate fully with federal investigators in hopes of avoiding corporate criminal charges. By 4 o'clock, news broke that prosecutors were seeking criminal indictments against Henrique personally on multiple counts of fraud, bribery, money laundering, and conspiracy, with potential prison sentences that could total several decades if he was convicted on all charges. By 6 in the evening, his wife of 28 years had informed him via her attorney that she was filing for immediate divorce and seeking emergency court orders to protect her share of assets from being seized or liquidated, making clear through lawyers that she had no interest in standing by him through this scandal and wanted to distance herself legally and financially as quickly as possible. Henrique spent that entire horrific day in his home office, making desperate phone calls to attorneys and accountants and business associates trying to understand what was happening and how to stop the cascade of disasters. But with each hour, the situation only got worse as more allies abandoned him and more accusers came forward with evidence of his various frauds and crimes and ethical violations. By the time darkness fell that Tuesday evening, Henrique sat alone in his office, understanding with devastating clarity that everything he had built over 3 decades was gone or would be gone within days or weeks. that he would likely face significant prison time and financial ruin, that his reputation was permanently destroyed and his family had publicly rejected him, and that at 53 years old, he was facing the terrifying prospect of losing literally everything and having to start over from nothing, assuming he wasn't incarcerated for years. The one person who didn't abandon Henrique during that catastrophic day was someone he had barely noticed or acknowledged as a human being during the 7 years she had worked cleaning his house 3 times per week. A 50-year-old woman named Rosa Silva, who arrived at her usual time of 4:30 that Tuesday afternoon to clean the mansion as scheduled, completely unaware of the drama unfolding in Henrique's world because she didn't follow business news or have any idea what her employer did for a living beyond the vague understanding that he was some kind of wealthy businessman who built buildings. Rosa was a Brazilian immigrant who had come to the country 15 years ago with her husband and teenage daughter seeking better opportunities, and she had been working various housekeeping and cleaning jobs ever since to help support her family while her husband worked in construction and their daughter attended university studying engineering. Rosa had learned over years of cleaning wealthy people's homes to be essentially invisible, to do her work efficiently and quietly without drawing attention or attempting conversation, to respect privacy and boundaries, and to never comment on or show curiosity about the lives and dramas of the people who employed her. She had cleaned Henrique's massive house for 7 years, and he had probably spoken to her directly no more than 20 times total, usually just to complain about something not clean to his satisfaction or to tell her not to bother him when he was working. He paid her reasonably well by housekeeping standards, though certainly not generously given his enormous wealth, and he showed no interest in her as a person beyond her function of keeping his house immaculate. Rosa had formed impressions of Henrique over the years based on observation rather than conversation, noting his expensive clothes and cars and obvious arrogance, the way he spoke dismissively to people on phone calls, including his own family, the complete absence of warmth or joy in this beautiful house that seemed more like a museum than a home, the occasional angry outbursts when something minor went wrong that revealed a man with very little emotional regulation or empathy for others. When Rosa arrived that Tuesday afternoon and let herself in with her key, as she always did, she immediately sensed that something was very wrong, because the house, which was usually empty at this time of day when Henrique was at his office, had multiple cars in the driveway, including several she didn't recognize, and there were raised voices coming from the office area, which was extremely unusual. Rosa quietly went about her normal cleaning routine, starting in the kitchen and guest areas, staying away from wherever the commotion seemed to be centered, but she couldn't help overhearing fragments of heated conversations and phone calls that suggested some kind of serious business crisis was happening. She saw well-dressed men and women she didn't recognize leaving the house with papers and boxes, looking grim and avoiding eye contact, and she heard Henrique's voice at one point shouting angrily at someone about betrayal and loyalty and legal liability in ways that suggested relationships and alliances were fracturing. By 6 in the evening, when Rosa was finishing her scheduled cleaning and preparing to leave, the house had finally gone quiet with all the visitors apparently departed, and Rosa hesitated about whether to just leave as she normally would, or whether to check if Henrique needed anything, given that she could tell something serious was wrong, even if she didn't understand the details. Her natural kindness and compassion won out over her habit of staying invisible, and she knocked gently on the office door before opening it slightly and asking in her accented English if Mr. Henrique was okay and if he needed anything before she left for the day. She found him sitting in his expensive leather chair in the dark with the curtains closed, still wearing his suit from the morning but with his tie loosened and his usually perfect hair disheveled, staring at nothing with an expression of absolute devastation and shock that she had never seen on his face in all the years she had worked for him. Henrique looked up when Rosa spoke, and for a moment he seemed confused about who she was and why she was there, as if he had completely forgotten that this was the day she cleaned, and that there was a regular person still going about normal routines while his world disintegrated around him. He waved his hand dismissively and told her in a voice that sounded hollow and defeated pleaded that she should just go home and not worry about anything, but something in his expression and tone made Rosa pause rather than immediately leaving. Against all her training and instincts about maintaining professional boundaries and not getting involved in employers' personal problems, Rosa asked gently if she could make him something to eat since it was dinner time, and she suspected based on the chaos of the day that he probably hadn't eaten anything. Henrique started to refuse automatically, but then seemed to realize he was indeed hungry, having skipped both breakfast and lunch in the crisis, and he nodded slightly and told her that would be fine if she didn't mind, though there probably wasn't much food in the house since his wife normally managed that, and she had apparently left earlier that day with no indication of when or if she would return. Rosa went to the kitchen and assessed what ingredients were available, finding enough to make a simple but nourishing meal of rice and beans and chicken and vegetables, basic comfort food that reminded her of her childhood in Brazil and that she had learned over decades of limited budgets could feed a family adequately without requiring expensive or elaborate ingredients. She cooked methodically and carefully, and while the food simmered, she cleaned up the kitchen, which had been left in disarray by whoever had been in the house earlier that day, finding comfort and purpose in these simple domestic tasks that felt manageable and under her control, unlike the complicated business crises and personal dramas that she couldn't understand or help with in any meaningful way. When the food was ready, Rosa set the table in the kitchen rather than the formal dining room because it felt more appropriate and less lonely to eat in a smaller, cozier space, and she went to tell Henrique that dinner was ready if he wanted to eat. Henrique came to the kitchen looking slightly more composed than earlier, though still obviously shaken and distressed, and he sat at the kitchen table, which he probably hadn't done in years, given that he normally ate either at expensive restaurants or in his formal dining room when entertaining business associates. Rosa served him the food and then turned to leave, giving him privacy to eat. But Henrique surprised both of them by asking her somewhat hesitantly if she would sit and eat with him because he didn't want to be alone right now and he needed human company even if they didn't really know each other. Rosa hesitated because this was extremely unusual and crossed normal employer-employee boundaries, but something in Henrique's obvious need and vulnerability made her agree, and she sat across from him at the kitchen table with her own plate of food, and they ate together in mostly silence at first, neither quite sure what to say or how to navigate this unprecedented situation. After several minutes of quiet eating, Henrique began speaking almost as if talking to himself rather than directly addressing Rosa, telling her in a flat, emotionless voice about the events of the day and how he had lost essentially everything, including his company, his reputation, his marriage, probably his freedom if criminal charges were filed as seemed likely, and his entire sense of identity and worth that had been built around being successful and wealthy and powerful. He admitted that he had made many mistakes and committed actions he wasn't proud of in pursuit of success and money, that he had prioritized accumulation over everything else, including integrity and relationships and basic human decency, and that now he was facing consequences that felt overwhelming and that he honestly didn't know how to handle or survive. Rosa listened without interrupting or judging, just being present with his pain and allowing him to express feelings he probably couldn't share with anyone else who knew him, given that all his former friends and allies had abandoned him in his moment of crisis. When Henrique finally stopped talking and fell back into heavy silence, Rosa spoke quietly and thoughtfully about her own experiences with loss and difficulty, telling him about coming to this country with almost nothing and working incredibly hard for years to build a stable life for her family, about times when money was so tight they didn't know how they would pay rent or buy food, about her husband getting injured on a construction site and being unable to work for 6 months while they struggled to survive on her cleaning income alone with no health insurance or safety net. She talked about her daughter facing discrimination and obstacles in school because of her accent and immigrant status, but persevering through determination and hard work to earn scholarships to university, about the constant anxiety of living without documentation initially and the fear that at any moment they could be deported and lose everything they had worked for. She said she was not comparing her struggles to his because everyone's difficulties were unique and personal, but she wanted him to know that she had some understanding of what it felt like when your world fell apart and you didn't know if you could survive or rebuild. Rosa continued by saying something that would stick with Henrique long after that difficult evening, and that would eventually help change his entire perspective on life and value and meaning. She told him that when she had been at her lowest and most desperate points, she had learned that the things that really mattered and that actually kept you going weren't money or status or success by conventional measures, but rather were the people who loved you and whom you loved in return. The simple daily blessings like food and shelter and health. The dignity that comes from doing honest work even if that work isn't prestigious or highly paid. And the peace that comes from living with integrity and treating others with kindness regardless of what you get in return. She said that Henrique had lost material things and social status, which was certainly painful and disorienting, but that if he still had his health and his mind and his ability to work and potentially to rebuild relationships with people who mattered, then he actually hadn't lost everything, and he had opportunity to create a different kind of life that might ultimately be more meaningful, even if less superficially impressive. Henrique listened to Rosa's words with a mixture of skepticism and desperate hope, wanting to believe that somehow this catastrophe might lead to something better, but struggling to imagine what a good life would look like without the wealth and power and status that had defined him for so long. He found himself asking Rosa questions about her life and her family and her experiences, actually curious for the first time in the 7 years she had worked for him about who this woman was and what her story might be beyond just her function of cleaning his house. Rosa shared more about her daughter, who was now 23 and working as a junior engineer at a tech company while finishing her master's degree at night, about her pride in how her daughter had succeeded despite all the obstacles and disadvantages she had faced, about her husband, who was a good man and hardworking father, even though they had struggled financially and didn't have the luxuries that many people took for granted. She talked about her faith and her community at her local church, where people supported each other through difficulties, about the satisfaction she got from doing her work well, even though many people looked down on house cleaners and considered them inferior or invisible. They talked for over 2 hours that evening, far longer than Rosa had planned to stay, and much longer than Henrique would normally have been willing to spend in conversation with someone he considered beneath his social level. But the extraordinary circumstances and the absence of anyone else who would talk to him made this extended conversation possible and meaningful. When Rosa finally said she really needed to leave and get home to her own family, Henrique thanked her with more sincerity and emotion than he could remember expressing to anyone in years, telling her that she had been kinder to him in his crisis than any of his supposed friends or business associates had been, and that he would remember this evening and her compassion. Rosa simply smiled and told him that everyone deserves kindness, especially when they're suffering, and that she hoped things would work out somehow, even though she understood the situation was very difficult. Over the following days and weeks, as Henrique's legal and financial situation continued deteriorating with criminal charges formally filed and assets being seized and frozen by courts and creditors, the one constant in his increasingly empty life was Rosa, who continued showing up 3 times per week to clean, even though Henrique had told her he probably couldn't pay her much longer once his remaining accessible cash ran out. Rosa said she would keep coming anyway, and they would figure out payment later when his situation stabilized. And in the meantime, she would help however she could, because everyone needed support during hard times, regardless of whether they could afford to pay for services. Her loyalty and kindness were so rare in Henrique's experience that he found himself both deeply moved and somewhat ashamed that he had never really seen or valued this woman during the years she had worked for him, that he had treated her as invisible and replaceable when she was actually demonstrating more genuine character and compassion than anyone from his previous life who had supposedly been his friends and allies. As weeks turned into months and Henrique's legal battles dragged on with attorneys consuming what little money he had left and criminal trial looming, Rosa became something like a friend and confidant, providing not just cleaning services but also human connection and practical wisdom and emotional support support that helped keep Henrique from sinking into complete despair and self-pity. She encouraged him to use this forced pause in his frantic career to actually think about what kind of person he wanted to be and what values he wanted to live by going forward, regardless of what the courts decided about his legal fate. She challenged him gently but firmly when he slipped into self-justifying rationalizations about his past behavior or blamed others for his downfall rather than taking genuine responsibility for his choices and actions. She also helped him in practical ways like teaching him to cook basic meals since he had never learned, and his wife had always handled that, or they had eaten out, showing him how to do his own laundry and cleaning so he wouldn't be completely helpless if he couldn't afford household staff anymore, introducing him to the basics of budgeting and living within limited means, which were skills he had never needed but would desperately require if he lost everything. The transformation in Henrique's attitudes and behavior was gradual but unmistakable, visible to the few people who still had contact with him, including his attorneys and his adult children, who reluctantly agreed to occasional visits after months of refusing to see him. He became less arrogant and defensive, more willing to acknowledge his failures and mistakes, more capable of seeing other people as complete human beings rather than just as instruments for his purposes. He started attending a support group for people dealing with legal troubles and financial ruin, where he met others who had fallen from various heights and who were trying to rebuild lives and make amends for harms they had caused, and he found unexpected comfort in connecting with people who understood the shame and fear and uncertainty he was experiencing. He began volunteering at a non-profit that helped formerly incarcerated people find employment and housing, partly as community service that his attorneys thought would look good to the judge, but increasingly because he found meaning and purpose in using his business skills to actually help people rather than just enriching himself. The romantic dimension of the story developed very slowly and unexpectedly over approximately 18 months after Enrique's initial crisis, as his friendship with Rosa deepened into something neither had anticipated or planned, but that felt natural given how much time they were spending together and how vulnerable and authentic they had learned to be with each other. Rosa was the one person who had seen Enrique at his absolute worst and lowest, and who had chosen to stay and help rather than abandoning him like everyone else had done. And Henrique found himself developing feelings for her that went far beyond gratitude into genuine romantic love based on deep respect for her character and her strength and her capacity for compassion even towards someone who arguably didn't deserve it. Rosa was initially very resistant to seeing their relationship as anything more than employer-employee or possibly friendship, because she worried about power dynamics even though Henrique no longer had wealth or power, and she was concerned about what her family and community would think about her dating someone who was facing criminal charges and who came from such a different world, and who had a history of treating people like her poorly. But Henrique was patient and respectful of Rosa's boundaries and concerns, never pushing or demanding, but instead demonstrating through consistent behavior over many months that his transformation was genuine and lasting, that he had learned to value her and people like her not despite but precisely because of their lack of pretension and their commitment to honest work and their capacity for kindness without expectation of reward. He got to know Rosa's family and was welcomed eventually into their community and their church, where he found a sense of belonging and acceptance he had never experienced in his previous wealthy social circles. He learned Portuguese so he could communicate better with Rosa's extended family and understand the cultural background that had shaped her values and worldview, and he started working in construction himself once his criminal case was resolved with a plea agreement that involved significant fines and restitution, but no prison time due to his cooperation with investigators and his genuine efforts at making amends. The wedding was simple and meaningful, held in Rosa's church with her family and community present, along with a few people from Henrique's past life who had reconnected with him after seeing his genuine transformation and his humble acceptance of consequences for his actions. His adult children attended after much hesitation, still processing their complex feelings about their father's spectacular fall and his relationship with someone from such a different background and social class. But gradually they came to appreciate Rosa's positive influence on their father, and to recognize that she had helped save him from becoming completely bitter and self-destructive during his crisis. The ceremony emphasized values of redemption and second chances, and choosing who you want to be regardless of circumstances, and many attendees commented that they had never seen Henrique look so genuinely happy and peaceful, despite having lost all his former wealth and status. Today, 5 years after that catastrophic Tuesday when Henrique lost everything, he and Rosa live in a modest apartment, both working regular jobs and living within their means. And Henrique will tell anyone who asks that he is happier and more fulfilled now than he ever was during his years of wealth and power and success. He works as a project manager at a nonprofit organization that builds affordable housing, using his construction and development expertise to help create housing for low-income families rather than luxury condos for wealthy investors. Rosa continues working as a house cleaner part-time, while also studying to become a certified nursing assistant because she wants to expand her skills and help people in healthcare settings. And Enrique supports her educational goals the way she supported him through his darkest time. Henrique has rebuilt relationships with his adult children who have slowly forgiven him for his past failures as a father and who respect the genuine changes they've witnessed in his priorities and behavior, and he's become a beloved grandfather to their children, teaching them lessons about integrity and kindness that he wishes he had learned earlier in his own life. He has made financial restitution to people he defrauded and has apologized personally to workers he exploited, and has used his story as a cautionary tale in speaking to business students and professionals about the long-term costs of unethical behavior and the empty promises of success without integrity. Most importantly, he has learned that Rosa was absolutely right that evening when she told him he hadn't really lost everything as long as he had his health and his capacity to work and his opportunity to build genuine relationships and live with integrity going forward. The deeper truth of this story isn't just about a wealthy man losing everything and learning humility through suffering, though those elements are certainly present and important. The real lesson is about the blindness that comes with privilege and success, how people at the top of social hierarchies often genuinely cannot see the full humanity and value of people they consider beneath them, socially or economically, how we miss profound wisdom and connection when we're so focused on accumulating more wealth and status that we treat everyone around us as either competitors to defeat or instruments to use, rather than complete human beings worthy of respect and relationship. It teaches us that sometimes catastrophic loss is actually a gift in disguise if it forces us to confront our false values and empty priorities and gives us opportunity to rebuild our lives around what actually matters rather than what society tells us should matter. This story reminds us that the people who clean our homes and serve our food and do essential but undervalued labor in our society are complete human beings with rich interior lives and hard-won wisdom and capacity for compassion that often exceeds what we find in prestigious professional circles. It challenges us to examine our own attitudes about social class and worth, to question whether we're truly seeing and respecting everyone we encounter, or whether we've internalized hierarchies that allow us to dismiss and overlook people based on their economic status or job title. It shows us that character and integrity are far more valuable than wealth or success, that kindness and compassion are strengths, not weaknesses, that the way we treat people when we have power reveals far more about our true nature than how we behave when we're desperate and vulnerable. Most fundamentally, this story teaches that material loss doesn't have to be purely destructive, and that sometimes having everything taken away creates space for something far more valuable to emerge, which is authentic relationship and genuine purpose, and life lived according to values that can actually sustain meaning and satisfaction, rather than just providing superficial markers of status. It reminds us that we always have choices about who we want to be regardless of our external circumstances, that redemption and transformation are possible at any age, that the most important measure of a life isn't wealth or achievement, but rather the quality of our relationships and the positive impact we make on people around us through how we choose to show up in the world with whatever resources and opportunities we have available. If this story moved you and made you think differently about success and failure, about who deserves respect and value in our society, about the potential for transformation even after catastrophic loss and moral failure, please leave a like on this video so I know this kind of content resonates with you and challenges comfortable assumptions. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss future stories about redemption and second chances, about learning to see people we've been taught to overlook, about building lives of genuine meaning rather than just accumulating symbols of status. And please share in the comments your own experiences with loss that ultimately led to positive transformation, or times when someone you initially looked down upon or dismissed ended up teaching you crucial lessons or providing essential support, because your stories inspire all of us to remain open to learning and growing, regardless of our age or circumstances, and to approach every person we meet with curiosity and respect rather than judgment based on superficial markers of status or class.